Fall of Shadow the Hedgehog, Sonic Adventure 2, 2001. The Space Colony ARK plummets toward Earth, and the one being sent to stop it is already falling. The ARK's collision course is the entire crisis of Sonic Adventure 2's hero story, set aboard the Space Colony ARK itself, where Sonic faces Shadow in the story's defining confrontation. Sonic's victory triggers a giant explosion that sends the colony hurtling toward the planet, a chain of events set in motion by Project Shadow, whose leader is Gerald Robotnik, the scientist who built the colony and engineered the entire program. Gerald's creation, Shadow the Hedgehog, existed solely to carry out that work. Shadow's origin is written in blood. Maria, the only person who ever treated him like a person instead of a weapon, was killed by the military while helping him escape the colony. The promise he made to her before she died, a promise he carries through every subsequent appearance, is what finally drives him to confront Final Hazard and sacrifice himself to save the world from the colony's impact. He dies finishing the job, no recovery, no backup plan. The camera pans away from a body falling into the atmosphere, and that's where the story leaves him. The canon leaves the rescue unshown between scenes, with no ship visible during the fall itself. The game shows Shadow falling like a meteor, and the visual language of that scene is unmistakable. It is a death, rendered with the kind of specificity that makes the franchise's previous character dies and comes back. Moments look like temporary setbacks by comparison. Maria was killed by the military in cold blood while aiding his escape, and now Shadow dies above Earth in roughly the same way. A person who tried to do the right thing, cut down before they could finish. The promise to Maria, his last human connection, is the fuel that gets him to that final blow. And the story seems genuinely prepared to let that be the end of him. At the very end of Sonic Adventure 2, the camera pulls back to Earth and there is a glimpse of Shadow's ghost lingering above the atmosphere. The game shows it, it lingers on it, then cuts to black. Gerald Robotnik, the man who built the colony and designed the weapon that killed his own granddaughter, dies as the ARK crashes in the story's final moments. He dies having outlived the thing he created to outlive everything, and the execution lands as a kind of cosmic punctuation, the creator destroyed by the same machinery that consumed his creation. The narrative structure at this point delivers a definitive confrontation with the story's central antagonist. He shouldn't be back, what this actually means for a person. Gerald spent a lifetime trying to engineer something that could outlast death, that could survive anything, that could carry a promise beyond the grave, and in the end, it fell like a stone. The thing he made could not save Maria, could not save him, and could not even save itself. A man's entire life's work proves insufficient at the exact moment he needed it most. People will say Chaos Control was always capable of pulling him back, that Sega had already committed to Shadow as the franchise's third pillar, that the postgame in Sonic Heroes practically announces the retcon with an excess of Shadow characters arriving within a single game, as if the creative team couldn't decide which version of him to bring forward. The fall has no ship, no rescue, no escape. It reads as final on purpose. The death works as a story beat even if the business reality said otherwise, which means the writers understood what they were doing, built it deliberately, and then watched the IP department override it. What kills Shadow in Sonic Adventure 2 isn't the fall, it's the promise that the story kept well enough to earn its own reversal. This reveals something the series never fully reconciles. Sonic Team writes character death with real emotional stakes. They earn these moments, build them over hours of gameplay, and render them with a gravity that makes them feel permanent. But the Sonic brand cannot sustain permanent loss, and so those deaths become narrative events the series is then forced to undo, each retcon eroding the weight of the one before it. The most brutal deaths in Sonic aren't the ones with the flashiest animation or the loudest screams. They're the ones the story clearly intended to be final, that earned their finality honestly, and then got taken back anyway. That's the contradiction that runs through the whole canon. The game knows how to write an ending. It just doesn't know what to do with one. It's already written. Impaling of Sonic the Hedgehog. Sonic the Hedgehog, 2006. The game that came out November 14th, 2006 for Xbox 360 in North America doesn't just let Sonic get hurt, it drives a laser straight through his chest and holds the camera there. Mephiles is the one who does it. The attack is a beam shot directly through Sonic's chest, and the scene is staged with the kind of explicitness that had no business existing in a Sonic game. Princess Elise's immediate reaction, she says, "I don't think he's dead yet." tells you the story is deliberately leaving the question open, but the visual itself doesn't leave much room for ambiguity. A laser through the torso in a children's platformer franchise is not a standard gameplay beat, and the fact that characters in the game treat it as potentially fatal means the script itself decided this was a killing blow, not a dramatic inconvenience. This is Mephiles getting closer to actually finishing Sonic than Dr. Eggman ever managed in Sonic Adventure 2, where the worst Eggman did was blow up a space station with Sonic on it and have him walk it off by the end of the cutscene. The Chaos Emeralds bring him back. Whatever power Elise still had after her own arc, after everything the game put her through, was apparently enough to bridge the gap between dead and alive long enough for the Emeralds to do the rest. The revival is mechanical, clinical, almost incidental. The game doesn't linger on the return, it moves on. The impalement is treated as a story beat to clear, not a moment to mourn. And the internet noticed immediately. A viral gif of the scene paired with a giant Sonic Dies sign spread across forums and image boards within days of the game's release, becoming one of the most recognized pieces of Sonic internet culture before streaming even existed as a format. Fans debated whether the death was real, whether it counted, whether the game had actually crossed a line it couldn't uncross. And the animation quality of the scene itself only made those debates louder, because the death looks simultaneously like the most serious thing the series had ever attempted and one of the least competently executed moments in its history. Here's where it gets harder to explain. The scene has been heavily criticized for poor animation quality, with many calling it poorly executed and nonsensical within the game's broader story. The staging is awkward, the emotional beats around it don't land cleanly, and yet it's frequently overshadowed in criticism of the game by the infamous ending kiss between Sonic and Elise. A moment that functions as a kind of narrative black hole, absorbing every critical take on the game until nothing else seems to register. The impalement, for all its visual notoriety, doesn't get the same sustained attention. It's mentioned, it's mocked, it's memed, but the kiss scene keeps pulling focus, which means a moment that was supposed to be one of the darkest in the franchise's history is also one of its most overlooked, buried under a worse scene that somehow eclipsed it entirely. The scene presents a puzzle for anyone trying to explain how the Sonic franchise handles character permanence, because it exists in a category the series had never seriously attempted before and has never sincerely repeated since. The protagonist properly and explicitly dying by someone else's hand in a cutscene with witnesses, with no gameplay intervention to stop it, and then being brought back by a mechanism the game never explains with any care. The evidence that supports it is the scene itself. It shipped, it exists. The game frames it as a genuine death. The evidence that complicates it is everything around it. The sloppy animation, the offhand revival, the way the story treats it as a speed bump rather than a turning point. The impalement is real. The aftermath is not. What nobody has explained yet is why the game went as far as it did. Laser through the chest, princess weeping, character presumed dead, and then refused to commit to the consequences. The scene earns the gravity of a permanent death and then hands it back 5 minutes later without acknowledging that it just did something unprecedented. The question that hangs over the entire sequence is whether the writers ever decided what version of Sonic they were willing to lose, or whether the impalement was always a tease dressed up as a killing blow. The game never answers that, nobody else has either. Subscribe and tell us in the comments which character death you think was the most brutal. Let's get back into it. Death of Princess Elise III, Sonic the Hedgehog, 2006. Sonic bleeding out on a floodlit altar is one thing, but Sonic isn't the only soul offered up in his own game. Next up is the only royal in the Blue Blur's universe whose death is both preventable and, somehow, inevitable. Princess Elise III doesn't just represent the stakes, she is the stakes, and her ending lands like a gut punch precisely because the world is built around protecting her. Princess Elise isn't some side character dragged into disaster. She's the single surviving member of the Soleanna royal family, set up from her first frame as the linchpin of her kingdom. Her entire life is a contingency plan enacted by her father, the Duke of Soleanna, in the wake of his own fatal miscalculation. The Solaris Project, the Duke's catastrophic experiment, ends in his death. But this isn't just a story about scientific hubris. 10 years before the game's events, the Duke worked with the time-traveling Silver the Hedgehog to seal the flames of disaster, Iblis, inside Elise, making her the vessel that contains the force responsible for the Solaris Project's catastrophe. So every moment we see Elise in Sonic 06, she's governed by a rule no other character shares. Show emotion, even cry, and the seal shatters, releasing disaster. Try to imagine that as a gameplay mechanic you're forced to keep a child perfectly calm or the apocalypse resumes. When the egg carrier malfunctions and crashes, Elise is killed only to be rescued moments later when Sonic and Silver use Chaos Control to go back in time and save her, erasing her death from the restored timeline. Sonic's death is shocking, but it's declared. Elise's is woven into every threat, every line, the invisible doom on a timer nobody trusts. The facts are plain and don't let up. She's not a hero who charges into battle, not a sidekick with plot armor. She's the reason the kingdom still stands. No other character, not in Sonic Team's games, the anime, or the sprawling comics, is marked as both the last of their line and the vessel for an apocalypse. Her death snaps a two-generation chain. In the main timeline, her death aboard the crashing egg carrier would have freed Iblis, but the last story rewrites that outcome entirely, which means in the universe of Sonic 2006, the human cost is absolute. Elise appears to die when the egg carrier crashes, and in that timeline, Iblis would be freed. But the last story sees Sonic and Silver reverse time to save her, and in the final moments, Elise chooses to blow out the flames of disaster, erasing the entire timeline and every tragedy it contained. Execution of Gerald Robotnik, Shadow Generations, 2024. If the death of a princess was the ultimate security system gone wrong, what do you call the premeditated execution of a scientist who saw the whole deck of rules stacked against him and tried to flip the table? Welcome to Gerald Robotnik, one of the most brutal executions in Sonic canon, killed by firing squad after his revenge scheme. Gerald Robotnik isn't some background casualty or villain of the week. He's the grandfather of Dr. Eggman himself. The man who led Project Shadow, the driving force behind Shadow the Hedgehog's creation, doesn't get the mercy of being forgotten or retconned into irrelevance. Every release cements him as the architect of both legacy and catastrophe. His granddaughter, Maria Robotnik, is murdered while helping Shadow escape the ARK Space Colony. Gerald's response isn't to grieve in silence or vanish from the narrative. He threatens to wipe out humanity as payback, a scheme so calculated the military moves instantly, capturing him and labeling him an existential threat. It all comes to a head not in shadowy illusions, but through his own diary entries in Sonic Adventure 2, which reveal his final confession before a firing squad carried out the sentence. The tape doesn't fade out to ambiguity. The scene cuts away only as the shots begin, confirming, without spectacle, that this was never about moral ambiguity or heroic sacrifice. It's a raw removal. Then, decades later, Sonic X Shadow Generations drops on every major console in 2024, and makes it official again, publishing Gerald's own journal as part of Shadow Generations story content, not as bonus lore, but as a blunt, physical reminder this happened, and the world that followed is built on it. Now, you might think this is just a villain's death scene, a bit of flavor text for the edges of the franchise, but the specifics shatter that idea. Gerald Robotnik's death isn't a side story or an optional log file you can skip. In the 2024 film Sonic the Hedgehog 3, his story plays a central role in the film's plot, connecting the past actions of Gunn to present consequences. His killing is embedded in the canon's backbone, the rulebook rewritten to let the past drive every grudge, every act of violence years after he's gone. So, Sonic's universe never had a real no-kill rule, and Gerald's fate proves it wasn't an accident, it was procedure, broadcast, and then followed up for generations. The contradiction is resolved. There aren't protected characters in Sonic, there are just the ones who outlast the consequences. Cream the Rabbit. She's a flight-capable rabbit, and Chow Razor, a character the Sonic fanbase repeatedly called for removal from the franchise across gaming publications. Cream drew significant criticism from gaming press throughout the 2000s, with reviewers attacking her design, name, and place in the franchise. One commentator suggested killing her off or reducing her to a minor role comparable to Froggy, yet she persists. She continued to appear in Sonic spin-offs throughout the franchise. Here's the thing about that list of criticisms. They aren't describing a character who died in a story. They're describing a character the fan base wanted to kill off for years, and Sonic Team refused to oblige. The death in Cream's case was never a freeze beam from the Death Egg robot. It was a sustained public demolition campaign that ran across gaming publications for years, from rankings to takedowns of her visual design to mockery of her name itself. The writers never pulled the trigger. The fans did, and they did it in print. And the question nobody asked out loud is, why was a small rabbit character with a flight ability, who didn't threaten anyone, who didn't destabilize any plot, who existed primarily to let cream and cheese appear in spin-off titles? Why was she the character that provoked this level of hostility? Nobody investigated that question at the time. Christian Nutt's description, dopey looking, is telling because it's aesthetic, not narrative. Jim Sterling's criticism that she represents everything wrong with Sonic characters is a structural attack on the franchise's creative direction, aimed at its softest, least consequential target. The suggestion to kill her off or drop her to Froggy's level reads as a recommendation made by someone who had already decided she didn't belong, not as criticism of anything she actually did in a story. None of these attacks reference a specific narrative failure, a plot point that misfired, or a death the character caused. They are blanket condemnations of her existence, and they were published and circulated as though they were substantive criticism. And before you mistake this for a character who is controversial for her role in a specific story, the facts don't bear that out. Cream was controversial for being cute, for being female-coded in ways the Sonic cast traditionally wasn't, for having a name that sounded random to adult critics, and for occupying screen space during a period when the franchise was under heavy scrutiny for its own creative drift. The freeze attack from the Death Egg robot, the actual death being cataloged here, was a plot event. The character assassination was real, it was documented in mainstream gaming press, and it outlasted every single one of the critics who wrote it. Character motivation didn't matter, narrative consequence didn't matter. What mattered was that she became convenient to hate, and a community let that convenience harden into something permanent. The underlying mechanism is that Cream the Rabbit never got a brutal death in any Sonic story. She got frozen, she recovered, and she kept appearing. The brutal death here belongs to the audience's patience. A character became so culturally depleted by sustained criticism that her continued existence reads as an insult even when she hasn't done anything wrong. The Death Egg robot's freeze attack was temporary. The verdict from gaming press in the 2000s wasn't. That's the asymmetry that makes this entry function. The freeze thawed, and the consensus didn't. Cosmo, the Cedrian. Cream's Chow Cheese can fire a freeze beam that eventually thaws. Cosmo the Cedrian's final moment involves no such ambiguity. She doesn't get frozen, she doesn't get rescued. Her final scene closes on her sacrifice. In Sonic X, Cosmo, the Cedrian, is a female Cedrian whose species' homeworld, Greengate, was destroyed by the Metarex. She joined Sonic and his allies in their war against the Metarex and formed a deep bond with Tails. Her clan was wiped out by the Metarex, and she sacrificed herself to fulfill her destiny of fighting back against the Metarex. Here's where it gets specific. Cosmo's sacrifice isn't incidental to the plot, it's the payload. The Metarex had already destroyed Greengate, her homeworld, eliminating every member of her clan before she joined Sonic's group. Everything she does after that point orbits around the fact that she's the last known survivor of her species, acting from a position of total personal loss. When she fuses with the Dark Oak planet to weaken it, enabling Tails, Super Sonic, and Super Shadow to destroy it, she isn't trading her life for someone else's in a generic hero calculus. She's completing the mission her clan couldn't finish because the Metarex killed them all first. The love story with Tails is real within the narrative, but it isn't what drives the final decision. Revenge for a destroyed species is what drives it, and that distinction matters because it means her death has a single unambiguous cause, a war she didn't start against an enemy that had already erased everything she came from. The turn comes when you compare what Cosmo's death actually accomplishes versus what it's often remembered as accomplishing. The Dark Oak planet is destroyed, yes, but the Metarex as a faction aren't eliminated by that act alone. The sacrifice is narratively specific to one target, and its emotional weight comes entirely from the fact that the character doing it has no people left to return to. There's no home to go back to, no clan to mourn her, nobody from Greengate who will ever know what she did. That's the precision of the writing. The sacrifice isn't inflated to save the whole universe, because the story doesn't need it to be. It only needs to be large enough to match the scale of what she already lost, and it is exactly that size. What this proves about the category as a whole is that the most brutal deaths in Sonic aren't the ones that feel shocking or unfair, they're the ones that feel inevitable and earned. Cosmo's death doesn't play as a tragedy the audience objects to. It plays as the only available conclusion for a character who entered the story already carrying a finished war inside her. The brutality isn't in the execution, it's in the math. She gave the only thing she had left, which was her life, to destroy the one thing that took everything else. That's not a plot twist. That's a ledger that only ever had one entry on each side, E102, Gamma. Whatever was calculated about Cosmo's sacrifice, a death with a clear enemy, a clear motive, a clear target, is made worse here because Gamma doesn't have any of those anchors when he makes his choice. In Sonic Adventure, E102 Gamma self-destructs to destroy Eggman's base. He is the second formal member of the E100 genealogy. He appears in additional Sonic titles. He deduced that Eggman was the enemy and resolved to save his friends by releasing their animal batteries before detonating. Now I'm looking at what makes this different. Gamma was built to destroy, programmed as a weapon in Eggman's E-Series line, yet he chooses to destroy the base he was created to serve. Every other death in this video has an external cause, a villain's attack, a plot accident, a writer's decision, a war that didn't belong to the character dying. Gamma's is different because he initiates it himself. The self-destruction isn't something that happens to him, it's something he decides to do, after concluding that his creator is the enemy, and that the animals trapped inside other E-Series robots are his friends. The animal batteries he releases before detonating are the same power source keeping those robots functional, which means freeing them is the prerequisite for his own destruction being worth anything. The landing is the line someone repeats the next day. E102 Gamma blew himself up because he realized the person who built him was the villain, and that blowing himself up was the only way to do something right. That's not a complicated sentence, but it lands with unusual force because every word in it describes a choice rather than an accident, and almost every other brutal death in the Sonic canon is an accident of plot, not a choice of character.